Okay, thank you, and good morning. And I'm very glad to see so many people to come here this morning because you probably have a lot of drinks last night, and today's weather is, I even get my winter coat in Canada, and we have a minus 20 to 30 in the winter, but I use that. So right now I use that in here in New Zealand. That is amazing. So anyway, when I was when I was young, but I remember, although I say that, I'm still not old. So when I was young, actually I'm a science fiction fan. So usually I imagine one thing. First of all, I can see someone who cannot see in the real world, and I can talk to them, communicate with them. And another dream is when I travel around the world, sometimes when I went to like Italy, the Rome, and I'm so wondering what happened if I turn that corner. Will I get into the ancient Italy? I hope so, and yeah, but that is a dream. But with virtual reality and augmented reality, we are heading to that way. Especially right now, we have wearable devices with AR. That is even close. But we will have some question. Can this kind of experience or technology can help us in terms of learning? What kind of value we can add into our learning experience? So today I am so honored to be this session for the keynote speech chair, and I'm glad I would like to introduce Professor Eric Klopfer to give us a talk to answer our question. Probably also enlighten me to see if I can do that later to trace back to the time. So let's welcome him.
Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for having me here. It's great to be able to talk to you about these frontiers, I think, in augmented reality and virtual reality and learning. So I'm Eric Klopfer. I'm a professor at MIT, where I run the teacher education program and a group we call the Education Arcade. I'm also the co-director of a new initiative we have at MIT called the Jamil World Education Lab, which is sort of looking at educational issues throughout the world, both in pre-college, where I focus, as well as in university and workforce learning. I'm going to use some acronyms from my own programs because they're long names. So the Scheller Teacher Education Program I know as STEP, and the Education Arcade are what I know as T, and that's what I'll be using on my slides here. So a little bit about STEP and T and what our goals are in these programs. Primarily, it's to enable playful and meaningful learning experiences using the affordances of new technologies. And that means several different things, the way we accomplish that. Part of that is designing and creating new experiences. That's primarily what I'll talk about today. We do a lot of work on implementing and scaling those experiences. So we think about how those get out into the world, how teachers use them, how students use them, what are the technology barriers, what are the professional development implications, et cetera. And then developing capacity for more experiences. That means also developing teacher capacity so that they're able to use these technologies in their classrooms, as well as developing professional capacity around the world so that other people can develop these technologies as well. These are just a few of the different kinds of things we have here. Some of my own classes where we design games with students, some of the mobile work we do, which I'll talk today about, some of the desktop-based, that's an MMO that we developed several years ago that I won't be talking about today. As I said, mostly today, what I'm going to talk about is designing and creating experiences, but sort of the collection of these things here, the designing and creating experiences, the implementing and scaling experiences, and the developing capacity, it's all sort of in a process of design-based research. And presumably most of you know about design-based research, but I'll just sort of rehash this a little bit. This is sort of the canonical design-based research paradigm. We sort of analyze practical problems. So we're thinking about things that real people face in real classrooms, whether those are learning issues, technology issues, et cetera. We think about how we develop solutions to those problems. And we iteratively, and this is, I think, the most important piece, we iteratively test and redesign in practice. So we build things, we test them out with real people, and we learn from those experiences, and then we redesign them again. And finally, we reflect to distill design principles. So what I'll talk about today are some of that distillation that we've had, some of those design principles we've learned from generations, many generations in some cases of these projects, and just a few generations in cases of some other ones. So a little bit of an overview. I've already told you a little bit about what our goals are in my program. Just after this break, I'll talk about learning games and resonant design. So learning games in general, why we think about games in the particular with augmented and virtual reality, and then a series of design principles that we've recently written about called resonant games. I'll talk about mixed reality and how this plays a role within this space of learning. And then most of the time I'll spend talking about the technology affordances for learning game design using different kinds of mixed realities. First, augmented reality, where I'll talk about both playing games and making games. We involve students in both of those parts of those experiences. And then I'll talk about virtual reality and a project we call Clever. Because this has many parts to this talk, I'm going to actually punctuate different parts of the talk, and I'm going to use a technique that I'm borrowing from a colleague of mine, Woody Flowers. Does anybody know Woody Flowers? He invented the first robotics program, where you have these robotics competitions around the world. He's also a fantastic wildlife photographer, and he punctuates his talks with pictures of wildlife. I'm not quite as talented a photographer as he is, so I'm going to punctuate my talk with pictures of New Zealand. And we're going to go through different times of the day. I'm going to start here at sunrise, and that's going to be the first part of my talk, sunrise in New Zealand. So the joy of gaming. So when people typically think about using games for any purpose outside of perhaps gaming itself for entertainment, they think about that we must harness this aspect of gaming, that people, when they're playing games, they're having fun all the time, throwing their hands in the air, having just joyous experiences. And people think this is what games look like. And in fact, this is not what games look like. This is actually what games look like. This is from a photo essay someone did several years ago on faces of gamers. So these are actual people playing games, video games. And you can see this is not them throwing their hands in the air and having fun. This is them being what many people call being pleasantly frustrated. So you're sort of challenged in a certain way where you're wrestling with some sort of problem and it's maybe a little bit uncomfortable, but the joy of this comes from actually overcoming that challenge. This is a picture of my daughter a couple years ago at PAX East, which is one of the big American video game conferences. My daughter, I think, was 9 and about this tall at the time. You can see those are men that are literally twice her size next to her, but she is so focused on the objectives of that game in front of her that they don't appear to her at all. And this is, again, what gaming is. It's about that hard fun. As Seymour Papert coined a number of years ago, when he was talking about logo programming, that kids were having fun, not in spite of the challenge being hard, but because it was hard. Again, they wrestle with those challenging problems, you overcome those challenges in time, and that's where that joy comes from. It's also about, it's sort of a zone of proximal development that you're in. It's sort of in that edge of your expertise where you're sitting, and it's also really good for learning. So I've defined a series of design principles for games I call gaminess. So I think there's a certain set of structures in games that are really important that define them as games and that are also useful for us designing learning games. The first of those is interesting decisions. This is Sid Meier, who created the game Civilization. This is what he coined as an important characteristic of being a good game, that you have interesting decisions. These are not just simply decisions where you flip a coin and have to go heads or tails, but rather there's interesting, that you sort of have some information coming into them and you might know what comes out on the other side. There's consequences to those decisions, so you might be punished or rewarded for different decisions that you make within that space. There's some sort of clearly defined goals. I make sure this word is plural. There's not a single goal within a good game, but rather multiple different goals, and different players may choose to achieve different ones of those goals or prioritize those differently. And there's visible, measurable feedback. Sometimes people think about this as score, like a single number on the screen telling you how well you're doing. But in fact, in really good games, you have multiple measures of feedback. So you might have something about your health, your wealth, your score, the gear that you've collected, the way you've decorated your character might all be measures of some outcome that you're having that you may be weighing differently. And some people may decide that they really value the health of their character and the other people, their wealth of their character. And again, a good game gives the players those choices. And finally, there's some sort of underlying model or system. There's a coherent set of rules that governs this system. In a lot of the work that we do, these are actually simulations. We do these in science learning where there's a simulation underlying the game. But in other cases, it can be simply a consistent set of rules. And I don't define whether something is a game or isn't a game, but rather it sort of has this spectrum where there's things that have sort of little gaminess tendencies, and on the other side, there's things that have lots of gaminess tendencies. And certainly you can recharacterize those, recast those in different ways. And different people, you might you can see a kid and they have a pen in their hand, and all of a sudden this becomes a game when you sort of add certain structures around it. But the pen itself doesn't sort of lend itself to that. It's the person that's sort of creating those around them. When we create those technologies, we think about how do we embody the technologies in ways that make them more amenable to making games out of them. Resonant games, I won't spend a long time on this, but this is a new series of principles. We've looked back at more than a decade of learning game design that we've done within my lab. And we distilled a series of principles that we think about that are really good for designing games. And there's a book that we wrote coming out this spring from MIT Press called Resonant Games about these principles. The first one is designing for the whole learner. It's about sort of seeing the whole person, who they are, the context that they're in, what kind of interests they have. So if we're designing a game for a kid in a math class, we don't think of that student just as a kid in a math class. That kid has interests, they have hobbies, they have friends, they have a social network. All those things are things that we think about when we're designing those games. We design for communities. Because learning is social. I think one of the dangers we face in this sort of pursuit of personalized learning is that we're ignoring the fact that learning is a social pursuit. Learning is really important to learn with your peers, and we think about that very importantly. Sometimes that means we make multiplayer games where people interact directly through the game. Other times it's really just about thinking about how does the game become part of some sort of social conversation that's happening between friends? How does watching one player play how can we accommodate that within the design of our games? We design for knowledge, skills, and practices. A lot of cases when we think about game design, we think about things that are just about knowledge, but skills and practices are equally as important. We think about those things that they might learn that are transferable to other domains, the scientific practices that people have as we're emulating the work of scientists. We embody those as well. Sometimes those things aren't as easy to assess as the knowledge is, and that's an important consideration that I'm not going to talk about today. But it's something that's important that we need to think about in the future. And finally, we design for society, because these games are actually about players that exist in a real society. So it's about thinking about how they fit in that society, what their future is in that society, how their peers sort of exist within that society, and we think about that whole space. I won't go into these. These are a whole series. We have a series of sort of then underneath each of those, there's a series of sort of smaller learning principles that we've designed, and we sort of take them through a series of cases where these become instantiated within those games. Now, it isn't to say that every game has all these things equally weighted. In fact, in each game, we think about which are the ones we want to weight heavily and which ones are the ones we don't want to weight as heavily. And each game sort of has a reason for thinking about those things. Okay, so we actually get to those principles from resonant games. The way we actually embody those within the space of video games is we have to use the affordances of the media that we have. And we have to think about how we create those experiences using the technological tools that we have available to us. So that's a break. This is morning in New Zealand. This is at Lake Matheson, where we were recently. So now we're in morning time. And so I'm going to talk about the affordances of mixed reality. So how do we think about creating those learning experiences through mixed reality? So this is sort of the Milgram's spectrum here of different kinds of realities along one axis here. And at one end, we have things that are completely real, the reality. And at the other end, we have things that are completely virtual with no reality in them at all. And in the middle here, we have these sort of mixed spaces, which are augmented reality, which is a common phrase now. We don't hear much about augmented virtual reality, but actually that's becoming a more common thing that we actually see. Things like, I think the HoloLens are much more augmented virtual reality, in fact, than they are augmented reality. But I had another scale here. This is two-dimensional. So this is spatial scale on the other axis here, where we have very small scales at the bottom, tabletop scales. And at the top there, we have landscape scales, things that you play over the course of a city or something like that. And each of these technologies sort of has affordances within sort of those different kinds of spaces. And so we might think about if we had something that was really much closer to reality in landscape, how would we benefit from that? Or if it was here or here or here, how would we benefit from those different technologies? So that's some of the stuff that we think about here. The way we get to this space here is we think about two different kinds of learning theories. One is situated learning. I won't go into a lot of detail in here, but the premises that you'll need to understand are that situated learning is authentic, and there's debate as to what authentic means and whether actually some of the things that we do are authentic in that context. They're contextual, so they're not sort of abstract, but they're put into some sort of real context, and they're social, going back to those previous principles. And we also draw on embodied learning, where the body is important, so how you express yourself, how you move around in that space, and the physical environment that you're in is also important. And what we do is we try to use immersion and presence, that sense of being there. And again, I won't get into the details because there's lots of debate as to what immersion and presence mean, but I'm going to define it simply as being there, that feeling of being there. And sometimes that's because you are really there in the real world and you're just being sort of augmented in your experience. Other cases, it's virtual and we want to make you feel like you're there. And we use immersion and presence to sort of drive situated learning and embodied learning. That can be virtual, like you can see here, or it can be in this augmented reality space where you sort of have just sort of lightly virtual experiences. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to talk about two sort of spaces here. One is sort of up here in this corner here where it's roughly at landscape scale, and it's what we call lightly augmented reality. So it's things that use a lot of reality in that space and a little bit of digital. And then I'm going to kind of take a spin to the other end of the spectrum here at the end and go towards things that are much more virtual, and they're sort of between room and tabletop scale. Okay, so I'm going to start here in the augmented reality space at the landscape scale. I'm going to draw on some of the principles that my colleague Kurt Squire and I designed a number of years ago, thinking about augmented reality, but mobile devices in general in learning. And the first principle that we thought about for the affordances of those devices were that they were portable, that you could take a computer around with you to different sites within a location. So you actually, we developed these principles many years ago when the notion of smartphones was not yet developed, but people had PDAs like Palm Pilots and things like that in their hands. And the idea was that computing was becoming mobile and you were moving around with it. They were becoming social at that point. You could exchange data and collaborate with other people. Partly that was because you were walking around in the real world with them, and partly because you had some sort of communications. They could be context sensitive, so you could gather data. There were probes that you could connect to these devices. You could gather data. We were starting to get things like GPS as well at that same time. And they were connected, so you had some sort of connection to an internet, or at least peers that you might have locally to you, and those things could also sort of facilitate the learning experiences. And finally, there is individuality. So there's both the social context, but there is this individual context. So it's your device, it sits in your hand, and it feels like it has something personally meaningful to you. And that allows us to sort of foster things like roles and things like that we were able to use in these kinds of experiences. So within this augmented reality space, we think about how do we craft powerful experiences in real places. So these are augmented, lightly augmented. So we want to use as much as we can from the real world in those experiences. But we do want to foster deep learning, and we want to also think about how kids author these types of games, as well as how we make that authoring accessible to other people outside of technology professionals. So within augmented reality, as I mentioned, we have two goals. One is playing games. I won't go into this much here. And making games is the other one. At this break, in late morning, sort of midday, I will talk about playing games. So the first game that we actually developed, and this was quite a number of years ago, was a game called Environmental Detectives. And this was around 2001. And this is an actual picture from people playing the game there. This was a time, just to give you a sense of the time period for this game, we developed these on Windows mobile computers, and the Windows mobile computers could either have GPS or Wi-Fi, because there was a sense that why would you ever need to use both of those things at the same time? And so we actually designed games that either used Wi-Fi or GPS. This one was a GPS-based game. The idea here was a game where it was originally designed for MIT students, and they were briefed about an outbreak of health problems in the community, and they were brought in as a team of environmental engineers to help research this problem. So the actual problem was fictional, so there was not actually a problem in the community with health problems, but it was based on a real case. So we took a real case from another place and we transported it to MIT. We tried to use as much as we could about real data, real experiences, and embed that in that, but the actual health problem was not in our particular location. So they could do things like take samples from the ground, which were virtual samples, but based on a model of where this, it turned out a chemical in the groundwater was. They could interview virtual witnesses. They could do all sorts of exchanges with each other, et cetera. The interesting thing about this was that for certain people, for certain contexts, a lot of the solutions that students came up with what we were called socio-scientific solutions. So in fact, it turned out there was a chemical in the groundwater in this scenario that could affect health, but it didn't because we don't drink the groundwater in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where this took place. But it still was a legal liability, so it's this really sort of messy issue, which I think creates a really interesting space. And then the students decided what they wanted to do about this, and they took into account not just the sort of right engineering thing to do, but they thought about, well, as people are walking by MIT, what will they think about if we have like big construction equipment that's sort of drilling things out of the ground here for years on end? What will it mean for admissions and for recruiting and things like that at MIT? What would it mean for community relationships? What would it mean for the people who row on the river at the head of the Charles crew race each year? So they thought about a lot of these other community issues that we hadn't actually built into the game itself, but they thought of because they actually saw those things as they walked around and played the game in the real world. However, when we brought students from other places to MIT to play this game, people who didn't know Cambridge, people who had no connection with MIT or the community, for them it really became just a series of collecting dots. So the map had these different locations they could go to. They sort of went to them, they collected the information there, and they moved right along. They never processed that information. They never sort of thought about its social context. They never came up with these sort of much more complex solutions because they weren't really bringing in their own reality into this. They were just bringing in what the digital information we gave them in the game was. So that became a game about what we call collecting dots, which is what Pokemon Go is. So Pokemon Go is probably the most successful augmented reality game. It's generated a lot of revenue for Nintendo. It's brought a lot of attention to augmented reality. But it's really the connection with the actual place is very limited. Which Pokemon you might collect sort of are somewhat influenced by the geography or the location. Certain countries have other ones. But really, other than that, there isn't a lot of connection, deep connection with the area around it. So you really are just sort of looking at what's the closest dot I can collect, and I'm going to collect that thing for that location. Which is it makes for an interesting game in some ways, a scalable game in other ways, but it doesn't really sort of address the issues of sort of connecting the real player to the real locations. So when we do these kinds of things, we think about how do we actually connect those real and virtual? How do we make that a much more deep and meaningful connection? We want to use the real context, and we want to still make these scalable and accessible. I'll give you an example of something when we did this wrong. Early on, we were designing a game at one of the large zoos in the United States, and I was watching the first iteration of this game, and these were kids sort of standing, looking at their smartphones, and they were in front of a lion cage. And they were probably maybe about as far as I am away from that picture of the lion there. And the lion was roaring, and it was really loud. And they were trying to watch a video. And they looked up at the lion as to say, "Can you keep it down? I'm trying to watch this video." And we realized at that point that we had not done this correctly, that when the reality sort of takes away from the experience, then we've designed something wrong. So we need to think about ways that we incorporate those kinds of serendipitous experiences into the experience of the game itself. So our latest iteration of this is a platform we call Tailblazer. It's an online platform for location-based games. And we've done this, and I'll talk as I'm talking about right now, where mostly what we focus on is helping other people make games for their locations. So we work with zoos and gardens and museums, schools, for them to create games for their location, and then kids can play them at those locations. This is what the client looks like. So there's a heads-up display that you can use where you can sort of look around and see things. And there's also a map-based view where you can see things. You can see there's players up there sort of playing one of those games in a garden. Again, we sort of work on places in zoos and gardens and museums. We had a grant from our National Science Foundation to work with a series of zoos and gardens. The reason why we chose to work with those locations is that they have these sort of what we call invisible themes. So a zoo might have a message about conservation or climate change. In a lot of cases, people are sort of more interested in seeing the animals while they're in that place. But for the zoo, they really want to think about how you connect seeing those animals to their deep missions about conservation or climate change. Similarly, a garden might have a message about climate change or invasive species that they want to communicate. But just looking at the plants, you don't necessarily see that information. So those are two of the examples we actually had. So one was with the game called Zoo Scene Investigators. This was a game at the Columbus Zoo and Aquarium in Ohio in the United States. It was a game about the illegal wildlife trade. And players needed to collaborate and take on roles, view virtual evidence. And the zoo sees tens of thousands of students each year on field trips. And this became one of the options for the field trips that students could do. Similarly, we were working with one of the gardens, and they had a game about invasive species. They also see thousands of kids each year on field trips. The kids come there, and instead of just sort of walking around, they're actually walking around and seeing the plants, identifying the plants, but they're also using this game to help them think about the issues of invasive species, which can then be connected back to themes in their classroom when they return to the class. Finally, I'm going to take it into a different domain. So we think about science in zoos and gardens. And we've also done this in Old Sturbridge Village, which is a historical recreation site. It's a site that sort of recreates life in the United States in the 1800s. And in some ways, it might seem incompatible with a smartphone-based game that you're sort of trying to do a historical recreation. But they also thought that they had themes that they saw in this place that people weren't picking up as they walked through it. So people would see the blacksmith and the stagecoach and think it was cool, but they really wouldn't learn about the challenges and the thoughts that were sort of present at the time. So we created a game that was about an economics game where you take on a role, you take on a profession, and as you walk around the village, you think about the decisions that person might need to make about where they live, how they feed their family, what profession they have, and they take all that into account as they play the game. But they're sort of the curators and the people who are playing these different real life roles in the village also can give you information that you can then feed into the game. So we actually made it really compatible between the experiences that students would have as they came to these sites with the sort of historical recreation and still being meaningful experiences on their smartphones. So we try to think about, in this case here, it's about immersion and presence in a lot of ways comes from actually being in that site on that location. We try to use the technology, the augmented reality, to not detract from that. So you don't want to take a break from thinking about the real world around you. You don't want to break that reality with the digital environment, but rather think about how do you sort of lightly supplement it in ways to make that experience more meaningful. So we've done a bunch of research. This is research that was based on that last experience at the historical site. I'm just going to kind of distill some of the meaningful outcomes. So the first one was create interesting decisions. So one of the challenges is when you're just sort of asked to collect information, students will walk around, get to a location, collect the information, and move along. By forcing the decisions in the field, you need to sort of think about that information that you've gotten. So if you collect some information that says you now can spend your money on a nicer house or on another cow for your farm, and you have to make that decision right on the spot, you now need to think about, okay, well, where can I get information about what the implications of those two different choices would be? And so by thinking about that on the spot, they have to make those decisions. Leverage the surroundings, so thinking about what they can do from the real world. Can they sort of use a signpost on one of the buildings in their decision-making? Each player has to have their choice. There isn't a single right choice to make. So if you're walking around with your friend, you might make different decisions, and you can think about the ways that those play out. And again, with that, thinking about that friend, you might actually really benefit from actually seeing not just what you did, but what your friend did at the same time. So break here, getting a little bit later in the afternoon here. Hiker on the glacier. Making games. I won't spend very much time on this. I'll kind of go through this quickly. But one of the things we think about is how do we actually have kids make these same kind of games so they can study issues in their communities and make games about those things. And we've done this at a series of locations for a different series of purposes. Part of this is to actually have an implication from the game itself. Part of it is just to sort of have develop their voice and their collaborative and creative skills. This is what our editor looks like. I'm sort of map-based editor here. We use the Google Maps API. I should mention this is all free, that people can use this tool. There's a programming language, a bit like Scratch, where you have a blocks-based programming language to allow things to happen within your game with virtual characters and objects. There's a whole scripting language associated with that. We've done this in a few different places. One is an extension of the Zoos and Gardens project, and the other is a local haunts, so where kids made games about local history in their community. This was a game where they sort of studied issues in their communities, and they wanted to sort of bring up sort of hidden history within their communities. And in many cases, the students themselves don't know about that history, and they feel their community members don't know either. So this is a game called Ghosts of Drake Park that some students made. They had it played by this woman here. Does anybody know who this woman is? Yeah, I think I've heard it there. It's Michelle Obama. So this is from a time when I wasn't embarrassed to show pictures of my president's family. So she came and played one of the games that the students developed there. Okay, so late in the day here, I'm going to sort of jump from augmented reality to virtual reality. So virtual reality, this was a quote I saw, this is now a couple years ago, about a school that was sort of trying to develop a lot of work on virtual reality within their school. And the quote was, "Instead of playing video games, students will enter a fully immersive and scientifically accurate virtual reality chemistry lab. Does adding salt affect the boiling point of water? The student could reach out and with hand controllers, take a graduated cylinder, fill it with water, measure out the salt, light a Bunsen burner, add a thermometer, track the boiling point, and then repeat the experiment without adding salt." So you can do this in a lab for just a few dollars without virtual reality and sort of get the same results. And in fact, you actually may sort of gain additional results about measurement, a lot of questions that come up along the way. So our emphasis is rather sort of on that beginning there. What you should be doing is playing video games. You should be doing things that you can't do in the real world in virtual reality. You should be doing things that are either too dangerous or impossible or too large or too small. Those are the things we should be focusing on within the virtual reality space, not recreating things that are sort of cheap and easy to do in the real world. So again, we're going to try to get there through immersion and presence to these places. Immersion and presence is more difficult, I think, to develop in virtual reality than it is in augmented reality, but it's a thing we think a lot about. So we've thought about these affordances of full virtual reality here. The first one is immersion. We can make the participant feel like they're actually there within some sort of system. That's where we get situated learning from. There's perspective. We can provide points of view to the participant, either from another person or arbitrary objects within a space. There's some interaction. So if we, as our controllers get better, the interactions that you can do within that space become very authentic. So you can sort of feel like you can move things around with your hands. You can even now get sort of tactile feedback within those spaces. You can look around with your head in natural ways. There's sensation. So if you've done this, if you've used virtual reality, there's visceral feelings that you feel in your stomach. There's also emotional feelings that sort of happen at the subconscious level. And finally, there's some sort of spatial representation. So we can show 3D relations that are actually very difficult in some cases to even show in 3D on a flat screen. So other people have been using this for different purposes. So on the left here is some interesting work about empathy, and you sort of play different players that are different from yourself. And even unbeknownst to you, as you think about sort of walking a mile in somebody else's shoes, you sort of develop something about their perspective. There's 4 walls about the Syrian refugee crisis, which has been very effective. 3D video. People have been using this for realism. So this is some of the surgical stuff that people do. There's a large interest in virtual reality in medicine at this point in time. But as we sort of think about those media affordances, we think about how can we then develop design principles? What are the things that we can focus on in our STEM work where we think there's challenging topics, challenging concepts for students and teachers, and we can use those affordances to develop those things. So one of those is 3D structure. So we have things here like in chemistry and in biology where you sort of have important elements of 3D structure, which may not be easy to represent on a screen. Collaboration and communication. So this is an interesting game. I'm not sure anybody's played this. Keep talking and nobody explodes. It's a game where one person is in virtual reality and the other people are not in virtual reality. The person in virtual reality is trying to defuse a bomb. The people who are not in virtual reality have the manual to how to defuse the bomb. So they have to communicate with the person who's in virtual reality how to do this. And I think it sort of provides an interesting way to think about asymmetric communication within these kind of virtual reality systems. There's individual and system level perspectives. So this is a lot of work we do. In complex systems, students have a lot of difficulty seeing sort of individual entities within a system and the whole system. And we can think about ways that virtual reality can help them sort of bridge that gap. And finally, there's a concept of scale. So these are things that people have tried to do through video and sort of real life representations. We try to understand systems where we're at scales where we don't exist. And we think that virtual reality can really help with students understanding those. And that's what we're actually going to focus on in our work, Clever, which I'll mention in a second. But you can see that the ideas of scale sort of exist at very large scales, temporal scales, spatial scales within science. And the one we focus on here is in the cellular scale. It's a lot of time that students spend in biology classes studying cells. and yet they have very little concept of what that scale is. And within that scale of cells, that in fact it's not just one scale. Different things in the cell happen on different, on grossly different scales. So, getting late in the day here, at dusk. Clever. So Clever it represents this idea of cellular biology within virtual reality. It's a project we recently started with funding from Oculus Facebook in conjunction with the Game Lab at MIT. And we're building on work that other people have done. So lots of people have done work in cellular biology through games and simulations. This is some of the stuff here. And there's lots of videos out there that sort of take you through virtual cells. The interaction within a lot of those spaces is usually fairly limited. A lot of people are also using virtual reality already in various ways for science. You can see here stuff with lots of that 3D visualization that I mentioned in chemistry, biology, neurobiology there as well. Our space is the cell. On the left here is how we see cells typically exhibited in textbooks. But actual cells are much more like the one on the right. They're much more densely packed. So they have, first of all, they have multiple copies of individual organelles. And it's not empty space. There's lots of stuff in there. So our idea within Clever is to think about ways we use authentic representation. We want students to use sort of real life cellular interventions. So there are actually things you can do to visualize things within a cell or change things within a cell and put it behind a real world narrative that's sort of fun and gets at this concept of scale. We've spoken to lots of experts on this topic to try to help us design our thing. So many of you may have seen this video over there on the right-hand side there. Some really interesting videos of cellular processes. We've spoken to some of the designers of those systems, as well as people, scientists who study these systems, to try to think about how do they think about cells? How do they think about these representations? That's something we do a lot in our games, is think about drawing on the expertise of experts within the field, finding out how they think about things. What are the metaphors they use? What are the ways they think about this in their own heads? And how do we represent that on the screen? So the principles here are organelle design. So what do they look like? What do actual organelles look like? What is the real density within a cell, and how does that feel to move around in? And what are the relative scales we sort of move around the cell and work on different processes? Is protein synthesis different at a different scale than the DNA and RNA exist? So we've used a lot of also real images. So there's lots of, at this point in time, there are actually lots of great images that exist about people who have visualized cells using electron microscopes, and even the organelles within those cells. So this is what it really looks like. It looks like sort of that mess on the right there. The problem with that actually, though, is that as you try to move around that in a game, that becomes really not very interesting. It feels a little bit like sort of moving around in a very thick forest. So we have to think about ways that we leverage the sort of 3D capabilities to sort of filter out things that are either too close or too far, to have things sort of turn on and off over time without sort of getting back into the challenge of representing the really sparsely packed cell. Again, it's also challenging to represent scale in these cases. In many cases, because scales exist at so many different levels within the cell, a white blood cell and a bacteria are actually very different scales. And we want to sort of focus on different kinds of scales within different kinds of cells. Play testing. So we've developed several prototypes of this that we have now sort of in testing in our early phases of design research. One of the challenges that we encounter is how you actually get around in the cell. Again, it's sort of densely packed. It's in virtual reality. Many of you who have worked in virtual reality know that movement in that space becomes a big challenge without making your students and your learners nauseous. So we actually had two ideas for this. One, which we call the Spider-Man technique, which is where you have sort of the ability to point at something. People use this as teleportation. You point at something within the system, and then you sort of pull yourself into that thing. The other one is the holodeck, where you sort of stand on some sort of platform, and you can sort of move things around in front of you. So you don't move, but the things you can move either towards you or away from you, you can bring other things into your focus. And we actually developed both of these. Fortunately or unfortunately, the people we've tested with sort of like them equally. So there's people who prefer one and people who prefer the other. And that's actually a challenge that we have, is how do we sort of think about developing a platform that actually allows both of these kinds of things and allows for the same kinds of interactions. That's actually what we're trying to do, is allow people to sort of choose their mode of locomotion, because ultimately people are different. So I'm going to just show a short video here, hopefully. So this is what it looks like to move around within this space. So here's the inside of the cell. As you can see, we've tried to represent some of those different kinds of, there's lots of repeats of organelles. You can see it's much more densely populated than a typical cell that we see represented in a textbook. You can see that sort of the beam there that someone has to point out things. You can do two things with that. One is you can transport with it. The other is that you can use it to identify things. And you can, as you identify things, you have a clipboard there that tells you something about what those things are there. So they don't have big labels on them that sort of distracts you from moving around. And in fact, we can think about sort of either hiding or showing that information. But they can point at those things within the space and be able to see what they are. Here's a second video. So this kind of shows the sort of extent to which we've shown different kinds of organelles and structures within the space. Again, you sort of have the ability to point at things here. And you can see all the different kinds of organelles within the space. But yet we've sort of made it so that you can actually, you can move around. So as you can see here, this person's now moving around to that location. You can pick any point in that space and move to that location. As you get to that location, you can then identify what it is. I'm not going to go through all this feedback here. We've tested this with some students, with quite a number of teachers. We're thinking about ways that we actually think about implementing this in schools. One of the challenges with doing virtual reality at this point in time is that in many of these spaces, you actually have to have a headset on, and you're walking around, at least in some sort of small area here. You cannot see anything in the real world. And you can imagine the sort of, and some of you may have worked with virtual reality in classrooms, the sort of practical implications of doing this in a real classroom are really challenging. So two things that we're thinking about there. One is, how do we sort of do things that rely on that collaboration, where not everybody is in virtual reality. Maybe only 1 out of every 5 people is in virtual reality, and the other people have different kinds of screens and information that they're communicating with the person in virtual reality. The other is we are relying on the rapid advancement of the technology. Right now, the ones that you have that are mobile are sort of much more limited in terms of the kinds of interactions that you have within that space, but they're advancing very rapidly. And if we think about the work that we did in augmented reality, where 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when we started out and we didn't have anything called smartphones, and we thought about where we were going to be in 5 years, and we sort of hit that mark really, really well. I think we're at that same place in virtual reality. We have things that are commodity devices that we can use for this work, but at the same point, it's not something that's really commonplace and practical in most schools, but in the next few years, that'll become the case. And it's important to think about doing that because, in fact, we sort of saw some of this feedback. So this I'll point at this one quote here. Clever is very different from normal depictions that I've seen before. I didn't realize how crowded it was in the cells. Not even a 3D animation or a video of the cell gives you this in-depth a look. So this medium actually is providing some unique aspects to understanding. We want to make sure that we can actually leverage that as we move forward. So we're continuing to refine this. We're getting out this spring into into our first field trials. The trials so far have been sort of lab trials with smaller groups. So that isn't to say that I focused on this sort of area up in the upper left and the lower right. I think those are interesting areas. There's many other interesting areas to explore in this space. I think what we need to do as a community is think about how we map this out, how we develop different kinds of design principles for different places within this. Because I think that the kinds of stuff that we did in augmented reality, so I wouldn't want to do, even though we thought about this at one point, we could do a virtual cell in augmented reality to landscape scale where you're sort of walking around in a big field and it represents a cell. But it doesn't really leverage the advantages of that platform. Similarly, we could sort of do the environmental detectives thing where you're sort of doing something on a real site in virtual reality, but it sort of doesn't leverage that connection with the community that we're getting through augmented reality. So we want to match the kind of learning applications with the kinds of media affordances that we're creating here. And as we sort of look around this entire space, we want to think about how to do that really well. So with that, the night has ended, and I will say thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, thanks, Eric, for the interesting presentation. My question was about comparing AR with VR. Which one do you think has a more promising future? Thank you. Being a VR researcher.
Well, what I actually think is we're going to see, I gave you that spectrum along the way there, and I think what we're actually going to see is things that are much more blended along the way. So we'll see, more headsets where you can sort of change how much opacity that you're having, so you can see some things from the real world or things totally from the virtual world. In some ways, I think things that are augmented are a little bit easier to think about in a classroom, where you sort of have people that don't have their vision blocked from everything. So just from a purely logistical perspective, it's hard to think about how a teacher has 25 to 50 students all sort of immersed within some world and not able to communicate with them easily. So that becomes a challenge. At the same time, though, I think virtual reality is a lot easier to scale in terms of the content. When we're thinking about augmented reality, we need to sort of leverage the real world in some way. That it doesn't mean going outside. Does it mean sort of having enough space to do that in? So virtual reality has a lot of advantages there. So I do see a future in both. I really think that what we're going to see is a lot of stuff that's much more mixed than that, as the technology sort of becomes more accessible to do that with.
I think one of the concern about virtual reality is students might easily get disorientation because they cannot. It's totally immersed in the virtual world. So based on your experience, let's say in one section, how long could it last reasonably before the students kind of feel dizzy or uncomfortable?
So I think that really depends on what you're representing in that virtual reality. So if in the cases where you're sort of slinging the web and moving around in the space a lot, so that kind of locomotion that we showed there, I think the answer is it's relatively brief, 10 or 15 minutes that you'd want to spend in that amount of time sort of moving around. In the case where you had the holodeck, where you're sort of moving things around in front of you and not much was moving, the answer is, I think, much longer, at least half an hour or 45 minutes. So it really depends on what's moving around, what's being represented, sort of what's in your field of visual view. So I think there's a lot of things that matters with. It also matters on the individual itself. And that's why we want to think about ways that we can sort of have more blended learning experiences where some people are in virtual reality and some people are not. Because it allows people to sort of have different roles and do collaborative learning without sort of necessarily relying on the fact that everybody would feel comfortable for a long period of time in that space.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the very interesting talk. I think this ties in a little bit with what you just said. There's a type of mixed reality that's sort of whole room, and I was wondering if you've done any work in that space, and maybe I've just read about it. I haven't actually experienced it, so perhaps you can just.
Yeah, so for many years there's been like caves. People have been doing work on caves, which are immersive virtual spaces, where you can have lots of people sort of in that space, that virtual space. I think there's been a lot of really interesting work done on that. Other times it's you can have projections onto the floor, where people are doing things like that become sort of mixed reality experiences. I think that and there's been sort of good learning results based on those, and I think they do rely on a lot of the good principles that I've sort of laid out at the beginning about sort of having individual perspectives within those systems as well as collaborative connections to those systems. Again, I'm sort of getting back to the practical nature of those things. In many cases, those are more like the field trips that I talked about with the augmented reality. Those things are not necessarily practical for a school to have, and certainly for a school to have frequent access to this for the students. So I think that those aren't something that we focus on, because we try to focus on things where we'll have lots of students being involved in those. But I think the research on those so far seems like they're compelling spaces. And certainly if you think about them more like the informal kind of connections to formal learning, where you might have that in a museum or a university where students would go and visit that periodically, it seems like something that could work pretty well. I do think that notion of sort of more projected spaces, so you can have things either as a table or something on the floor. It's not quite fully immersive, but they are sort of digital collaborative spaces that can exist. I think those things will probably become more common as those technologies become cheaper. Again, I don't know whether those will be things that schools flock to because they still require a fair bit of logistics just to even have the space to use those kinds of things. But I do think that sort of from a research perspective that they're interesting environments.
Any question? You first, then Andy.
I'm just curious that if MIT work together with the medical or in hospital in health, because what you are showing is, I think the virtual reality is using it in the surgical procedure and many things. Can you tell us more?
So we're not yet, although we have talked to one of the local medical schools about doing some stuff for medical education. At least in the United States, medical education has been not necessarily from a technology perspective, but from a pedagogical perspective, it's been much more progressive than a lot of the other branches of education in the United States. And so they are sort of more apt to sort of try new kinds of things. And so we are talking to one of the schools about some work with virtual reality. And they are doing some already, at least experimentally. There's another question I'm thinking about how you use this for practitioners as well as students. And I think that's a frontier that we haven't explored. But I think it's something that in an industry like medicine, which is advancing so rapidly, that I think will become something that's pretty common.
Okay. How do you go around to planning something like this? Because it seems like if you have an idea to do something, and would you need a model to start planning? Because if you're going to do a game about something, it seems like a lot of time to invest in doing something. So then sort of thinking about the ARCS model of motivation, in which we have different steps and guidelines of these type of tools are used in these situations. Is there something like that for creating games in virtual reality?
So I don't think it's quite that refined yet. I do think that idea, though, of where you start is really important. I think, particularly in the space of educational games, there's sort of two mistakes that are made. So one is you sort of get a whole room full of game designers, and they start. And they're like, where should we start with this? And they come up with some ideas, and they're like, oh, we should probably ask somebody who knows something about learning to join our team. And eventually, 6 months down the line, they do that. The other mistake is the reverse, where you have a bunch of educators or educational researchers in the room, and they say, we should design an educational game. And they sort of start to design the educational content. They're like, we should probably invite a game designer at some point to think about this. Both those things I think are problematic. So you need to have people who know education, people who know design, and you also need to have people who know the content very early on in the process. And it's sort of a negotiation with those three, negotiation and sort of finding the common ground between those spaces. I think one of my colleague Scott Osterweil has put this pretty aptly. So a lot of times people will come to us and say, such and such topic isn't fun. Can you help us make a game out of this thing? And if that's where the conversation starts, we usually sort of walk away from that and say no. What we want to do is we don't want to make something fun. We want to show that something is fun. So it's not about making math fun. It's about showing that math is fun. It's about showing that cellular biology is fun. And the way we often start with that is we talk to cellular biologists, we talk to mathematicians, and we say, what is fun about this topic? You do this day in and day out. What is fun and interesting to you about this topic? And then what we think about is how do we use the medium to amplify that? So if it's about there's puzzles in my head that I do with these mathematical problems, we think about how do we use the medium to portray that? If it's about cellular biology and it's about, well, I really like the sort of 3D complexities and the way I visualize that, and I think about the puzzle pieces fitting together, I think you think about how do we use the media to make that a reality. So it's about sort of matching the medium to what people are already finding fun and interesting within that space, but a novice doesn't necessarily know how to access. And we use the technology to make that accessible to novices.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, just a bit concerned as an educator when the technology is going to improve and the corruption between the real experience and the virtual experience. So the child might think that the experience he had in the virtual world might be actually the real one. So the corruption of the memory is a bit of concern within this world as an educator to me. Yeah. So, yeah. The risk of failure in the virtual world is far less than the risk of failure in the real world. So that's the area of concern.
Yeah, and this is a concern that people have expressed for a number of years. I mean, we certainly see this within the space of games, that people say, well, if you do something within a game world, then you have an expectation that you can do the same thing in the real world and the consequences will be similar. So it's been something that people leverage a lot about against violence in video games. And the research actually seems to show that that's not the case, that people actually do make a distinction between what's happening on the screen and what's happening in the world. In the case of violence, there's sort of like short-term, 10 or 20 second measurable differences that you can sort of measure. But in terms of their sort of ethical and moral perspectives that happen, people are very good at sort of differentiating the real and the virtual. Virtual reality, I think, is a special case. Certainly, as we think about things like empathy, it sort of becomes much more real. I would be lying if I said I have the answers to this at this point. It's something that we certainly have to pay attention to. But I think as we think about this specifically within the space of science, there's, again, a notion of what is the reality of any kind of simulation or system that we present to students? And does it need to be completely real? And do they need to understand that this is an actual representation of the real world, or it's some sort of simplification? And I actually think that as a sort of a second level of understanding for students, helping them understand what is real and what is fictional about anything that they see on the screen is actually a really important literacy that we need to be able to teach. So they need to understand when I show a simulation that this is not the real world. There's some things that are like the real world, and there's some things that are not like the real world. And in fact, the differences between the real world and this thing are actually a really important thing to learn from. I think that goes with virtual reality as well. I think we need to be very explicit about what is real and what is not real about this, and that we can actually make that an important literacy that we try to teach to the students.
Just carrying on from that, I'm wondering what sort of thinking you're doing around about the connectivity, not just between the real and the virtual, but between diverse virtual worlds. Any thinking about what the interfaces need to be between those?
Yeah, I think this. I mean, I think as we start to get into the possibilities as we move into the future, I think it's really exciting. I don't really know the answer to that. We've done previous work with massively multiplayer games, which I think sort of can give us a lot of insights into how we might sort of think about bridging these kinds of different kinds of worlds, where we have much larger spaces. Right now, we think about the spaces, and they're fairly small. They're experiences that you can do in hours or days. As we think about using much larger spaces like we've had in MMOs that sort of exist for years, I think the possibilities kind of are endless and really interesting. I think about things like transportation systems and navigational systems and other ways we sort of think about ways to bridge those spaces. So I think it's really interesting and a cutting edge place to do some research.
Any last question beside him? No. Okay.
Hello. I would like to ask whether there's any teacher role, amongst those developments when he or she, the teachers, would like to adopt or implement this kind of platform into the classroom.
Yes, I left that out of my original of my three parties coming to the table: the experts, the educational researchers, the game developers, and teachers as well. So they may not be there at the very first conversation because we sort of want to limit and narrow the space a little bit. But I think at that second conversation, we have teachers who come in. We often work with, on most of these projects, we'll have a cadre of somewhere between 2 and 6 teachers who come in very early on and stay throughout the project. They're sort of our teacher advisory board. But they're in many cases, they're also teacher co-designers. So they're the ones who say to us, the problem that you're studying, that's not actually a problem with my students. They don't have that difficulty. Or they'll say, my students do have that difficulty, but you're designing a 3-week-long experience, and we spend 5 minutes on that topic in class. So I can't justify spending that much time. These are the misconceptions that my students have had. So they come in pretty early on, and they also talk to us about the practical implications of this. Like, there's no way I'm going to get the 25 computers with virtual reality headsets for 10 days of class time. We need to think about a way that we can do this with 3 days of class time, and think about other activities that interleave with this. So it's very important, I think, to sort of bring in those educators, both for their insights as well as their understanding of the limitations.
Actually, when I say, do you have any last question? Actually, I mean you guys, not myself. So I have one question, and I have one reality question, which means, as we all know, the game development and the virtual reality application required a lot of graphics art designer jobs, and most of us probably don't have that kind of resources to do this kind of thing. So first of all, do you have any suggestion for those some of us? We don't have resources, but we still want to do some kind of virtual reality application for education. How can we do? And the second question is, do you have any plan to make a clever, like a platform which provide editors and library, 3D model library, something like that for the teachers and the researchers?
Yeah, so I'll give two answers to the first question. So the first answer is one of the ways that we do it is with students. So in fact, most MIT students don't have those skills. We don't have a lot of art students. So we look to other colleges in the area where we can hire students at relatively low rates who want to get experiences doing game work. So that's who we rely a lot on. Some of the art colleges or colleges that have some sort of art or computer graphics program. And we hire those students at relatively low rates. The other answer, though, is that there's now, as sort of we start to standardize, it used to be that virtual reality was sort of, each person was developing their whole toolkit and their graphics and their graphics pipelines from scratch. And now it's becoming a bit of a commodity to do that. And so Google, among others, is starting to create a warehouse of 3D assets that you'll be able to use for free. So I think we'll start to see lots more sort of libraries like that at either free or low cost to be able to use some of those assets. When we're working in special domains, like I don't think Google's just going to have like random organelles for us to be able to use necessarily, but they'll have lots of other sort of more common things. But that's where we sort of that's the places where we can sort of hire spend our resources on some of that student help. Our goal is eventually that we sort of, the way we typically work in our projects is we build instances of things, and then we ultimately try to build platforms for things. I think we're still a fair ways away from the point where we can feel like we can develop a platform ourselves, but it is something that we sort of think about, particularly to think about the ways that we ultimately enable students to do these things. The idea we have lately is to not just sort of develop a general 3D virtual reality game making platform, but rather to think about things that we might do in specific areas. So like, could we make one in cellular biology? So students could design different kinds of cellular experiments or cellular processes as illustrations or experiments. Might we build another one in chemistry, certain areas of chemistry? So thinking about ways we might build more things that are more specific, that then people could build things using that particular system.
That's great. Thank you so much, and thank you for this very good, very great keynote speech. And let's have a big applause for him. Thank you so much. Oh, by the way, sorry, I almost forgot. I have one task. That is a gift from the conference, so I needed to deliver the gift for you. Okay, so let's. So this one is from the conference, and I needed to, give you this. Thank you so much for that.